The surgeon who saved the Apache woman, a fugitive doctor's last chance at redemption, Dr. Bap. Elias Monroe had once lived a life that many people would call perfect. In Boston, he had a steady job at one of the city's busiest hospitals. People trusted him with their lives. He could perform surgeries that seemed impossible to others. His hands were steady, his mind sharp, and his heart dedicated to saving people. Patients called him a miracle worker, and his colleagues respected him deeply. But life, as it often does, had a way of turning everything upside down. It began with a single operation, a surgery that should have been routine. A young man had come into the emergency room with a serious but treatable injury. Dr. Schnow. Monroe had performed hundreds of surgeries like this before, yet in that moment a small error, a slip of concentration, a wrong measurement, changed everything. The patient survived, but complications arose. Rumors started. People whispered. Slowly, the trust he had built over years began to crack. At first he tried to explain, to show that the accident was not due to carelessness, but no one wanted to listen. The hospital administration conducted an investigation. The press got involved. Headlines questioned his competence. For Elias, the shame was unbearable. He could not stay. His reputation was ruined, and he felt trapped by the judgment of others. With a heavy heart, he left Boston. He abandoned the hospital, his apartment, and even the life he had carefully built. He became a fugitive of his own making, not because of the law, but because of the invisible chains of shame and guilt that followed him wherever he went. He carried only a few belongings, including a small, worn medical kit, the few tools he refused to leave behind. He did not plan to stop practicing medicine. He could not. Medicine was not just a job. It was the part of him that gave life meaning.
"You want to put it in?" she screamed. What the rancher did next outraged the whole town. Tom Harris had always been a man of the land. For as long as anyone in the small rural town of Pine Creek could remember, he had been tending to his sprawling ranch on the outskirts. The Harris Ranch wasn't just a property. It was a legacy. Rolling pastures stretched for miles, dotted with cattle, horses, and the occasional flock of chickens wandering near the old wooden barns. Tom had grown up here, learning from his father how to plant, harvest, and care for the animals. Over the years, he had become known as a hard-working and determined man, someone who rarely let anyone interfere with the way he ran his ranch. Despite his dedication, Tom's life was quiet and predictable, almost too predictable. He woke up at dawn, checked on the cattle, repaired fences, and made sure everything ran smoothly. There were days when he barely saw another human being. He liked it that way. But that calm, predictable life was about to face a disruption that no one in Pine Creek could have predicted. It started one warm summer morning when the air was thick with the scent of hay and the buzz of cicadas. Tom was checking a new irrigation system he had installed near the southern edge of his property. The new system was meant to make watering the pastures easier and more efficient, but it had not been without problems. Pipes needed adjustments, sprinklers had to be moved, and the water flow sometimes created unexpected puddles that muddied the fields. Tom, ever the perfectionist, walked back and forth along the rows of sprinklers, checking for leaks and ensuring that everything was working correctly. He was so focused that he almost didn't notice a car pulling up along the dirt road. A small, dusty pickup truck came to a stop near the gate, and out stepped a young woman.
Without it, he felt empty, like a man who had lost his own shadow. The Southwest became his new home, a vast land of deserts, mountains, and lonely roads that stretched for miles without a single town in sight. Here, anonymity was possible. No one knew his name, and he could live without the judgment that had chased him out of Boston. He traveled slowly, on horseback at times, sometimes on foot, sleeping under the stars or in abandoned cabins. The desert was harsh and unforgiving, but it had a strange beauty that made him feel alive. The red rocks, the endless horizon, and the quiet wind through the canyons reminded him that life was bigger than mistakes. Despite the isolation, Monroe could not ignore the call of medicine. He treated anyone who needed help. Travelers with broken bones, miners with infections, or families too far from a proper hospital. Often he charged nothing, asking only for shelter or food in return. His reputation as a skilled healer spread quietly. People whispered about the mysterious doctor who appeared out of nowhere, saving lives and then disappearing as if he were a ghost. Sometimes he feared being recognized, worried that someone from Boston might catch up to him, but those fears were outweighed by the chance to help someone in need. Each life he saved became a small measure of redemption. Even in the middle of nowhere, challenges were constant. Supplies ran low quickly, and improvisation became a daily skill. Bandages had to be washed and reused, herbs substituted for medications, and simple tools modified for complicated surgeries. Every patient was a puzzle, and every operation was a test of his skill and patience. But these challenges reminded him why he had become a doctor in the first place. He did not need praise or recognition. He needed to act. The desert became his classroom and his stage, and every life he saved was proof that he still mattered.
She was carrying a clipboard and had a determined look in her eyes. Her name was Molly Sanders, and she had recently moved to Pine Creek. Unlike Tom, Molly was new to ranch life. She had inherited a small plot of land from her grandparents and was eager to make it productive. But small farms were never simple, especially in a town where every inch of land seemed to have a story, a rule, or a dispute attached to it. Molly approached the ranch gate with confidence. She waved at Tom, who looked up from the sprinkler and blinked in surprise. Visitors were rare, and strangers even rarer. "Hello," she called out. "I'm Molly Sanders. I need to talk to you about the property line near the southern edge." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Property line?" he asked, brushing a bit of dirt from his pants. "This is my land."
"What about it?" Molly held up her clipboard and pointed to a small map she had drawn.
"I'm planning to expand my irrigation system to water my crops, but it seems like part of your land is included in the plans."
"I just wanted to see if we could figure out a way to make it work." Tom frowned. He didn't like surprises, especially when they involved his land. He had spent decades cultivating every inch, and he didn't appreciate the idea of someone else encroaching, even if it was unintentional. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said cautiously. "Everything beyond my fence is mine. If your system touches my property, that's not going to work." Molly tried to stay calm. She had heard stories about Tom Harris, stories of a man who could be stubborn and set in his ways. But she had come prepared. She explained her plan carefully, pointing out that her crops were on a small hill just past her property, and the only way to reach them was by running a pipe near the fence. "I'm not trying to take your land," she said softly. "I just want to water my crops without causing trouble." Tom scratched his head.
Loneliness, however, was always present. There were nights when he sat by a small fire, listening to the coyotes howling in the distance, and he thought about what he had lost. He remembered the bustling streets of Boston, the laughter of friends, and the quiet moments of contentment in his apartment. He thought of the patients he could no longer see and the family he had never built. The weight of his mistakes pressed heavily on him, and yet there was a strange peace in knowing that every life he touched here mattered more than any headline or public opinion. On one such night, as the desert wind whispered through the canyons, Elias looked at his hands. They were scarred from years of surgeries and rough travel, yet they were still capable. He flexed his fingers, imagining the instruments, the careful movements, the delicate work that had once earned him praise. Those hands, he realized, were more than tools. They were a promise to himself and to the world that he could still do good. He had failed in one life, but here, in this remote and unforgiving land, he had a chance to start again. Not for fame, not for recognition, but for the pure purpose of saving lives. His travels were not easy. Some days brought harsh storms, blistering heat, or injuries that made even simple walking a challenge. Supplies were always scarce. He had to find clean water, sometimes digging or walking long distances. Food was often limited, and sometimes he relied on the kindness of strangers, travelers, ranchers, or small-town shopkeepers. Every act of generosity reminded him of the good still in the world, and every life he saved reminded him of his own worth. Elias had learned to move quietly and without drawing attention. He had a small, faded journal where he recorded medical observations, notes about herbal remedies, and sketches of injuries and surgeries.
He understood what she was saying, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his privacy and control were being challenged. Over the years, he had dealt with curious neighbors, wandering livestock, and even a few government inspectors. But a new farm expanding into a space felt different. It felt like an intrusion. He looked at Molly and saw determination in her eyes, a determination that reminded him a little too much of his own younger self. At first, the conversation was calm. They discussed the map, measured distances, and debated possible solutions. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, the temperature rose, and so did the tension. Tom could feel frustration building in his chest. Every solution he proposed seemed to be dismissed, and every suggestion from Molly seemed to require more effort on his part. He had spent decades perfecting his ranch, and the idea of changing anything, especially for someone new, made him uneasy. Molly, on the other hand, was persistent. She had invested her time, money, and hopes into her little farm, and she wasn't about to back down. She spoke passionately about her crops, the irrigation system, and the challenges she faced with the dry summer months. She gestured toward her plot, explaining how every drop of water mattered for her plants. "You want to put it in?" she asked suddenly, pointing at the pipe that would pass near the edge of Tom's property. It wasn't a question meant to be confrontational. It was simply her way of clarifying the plan. But the words hung in the air like a spark near dry grass. Tom froze. The tone of the question, combined with the heat of the day and his already tense mood, made his blood boil. In that moment, he felt as though his decades of work were being challenged by someone who didn't fully understand the value of hard-earned land. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words came out sharper than he intended.
This journal was a lifeline, a way to keep his mind sharp and to leave a record of his work for anyone who might benefit from it. He often thought of it as a silent witness, watching over his journey, reminding him that even when the world rejected him, he could still make a difference. As he traveled, he also observed the people around him. The miners, ranchers, and native communities had struggles of their own. They were resilient, adapting to a harsh land with courage and dignity. Elias learned from them as much as he healed them. He discovered new ways to treat injuries using local plants, new methods of managing pain, and even ways to prevent illness in small, remote communities. Each lesson was a small victory, each success a quiet triumph. And yet, despite the success, he could not ignore the longing for redemption. He knew that one day there might be a test he could not avoid, a situation where his skill, courage, and wisdom would be challenged more than ever before. He had faced the consequences of his past, and now the desert was teaching him patience, resilience, and humility. In the vast emptiness, he began to understand what it meant to truly serve others without expectation. Every broken arm he set, every fever he treated, and every life he saved was another step toward making peace with the man he once was and the man he hoped to become. And so, Elias Monroe walked on, the sun rising and setting over the desert, each day a challenge, each night a moment of reflection. He was a fugitive in the eyes of the law, a stranger to society, and yet he was exactly where he needed to be. The desert had no judgment, only opportunity. And Elias knew that one day that opportunity would come in a form he could not yet imagine. A test not just of skill, but of heart. Until that day, he would continue to walk, to heal, and to quietly reclaim the life he thought he had lost forever.
"Excuse me," he said, stepping closer to the fence. Molly tried to explain again, but the calm she hoped for was slipping away. The neighbors, who had noticed the small crowd gathering at a distance, began whispering among themselves. Pine Creek was a town where everyone knew each other's business, and any disagreement tended to spread quickly. People started showing up at the edge of the field, curious about the commotion. Some carried water bottles, others leaned on their fences, eager to see what was happening. The tension between Tom and Molly grew. They were both stubborn, both passionate, and both determined to protect what mattered most to them. Tom wanted to defend his land, his privacy, and his way of life. Molly wanted to nurture her crops, her livelihood, and her dream of building a successful farm. What had started as a simple property discussion was becoming a standoff, with neither side willing to give way. As the sun climbed higher, the story of this small confrontation began to spread. People in town would later say that you could hear the argument for blocks away, that it was impossible not to notice the clash between the seasoned rancher and the determined newcomer. Tom, usually calm and reserved, felt his patience tested like never before. He paced along the fence, checking his land while trying to maintain control over his temper. Molly, holding her clipboard tightly, refused to step back. She had a mission, and she wasn't going to be intimidated. By mid-afternoon, what had started as a simple conversation about irrigation and property lines had turned into a spectacle. Neighbors whispered to each other, children peeked from behind fences, and even the local mail carrier stopped to watch. Everyone sensed that something important was unfolding, something that would be remembered for a long time.
Elias Monroe had been traveling through the desert for weeks, following a narrow dirt trail that led him past red cliffs, dry riverbeds, and scattered settlements that seemed to appear from nowhere. The sun had burned his skin, the wind had stripped the moisture from his throat, and yet he pressed on. He had learned to move quietly, almost like a shadow, observing the land and the people who lived there. He carried his medical kit carefully in a worn leather bag, knowing that he might be needed at any moment. But he had grown used to the quiet. Life in the desert was often slow, measured in the steps of his horse, the rise and fall of the sun, and the occasional sound of distant wildlife. One late afternoon, while Elias rested near a small spring, he overheard a conversation between two riders approaching from the north. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices carrying a mix of fear and urgency. "She's hurt badly," one said. "Her leg, the horse threw her, and she's bleeding. If someone doesn't help soon, she won't make it through the night." The words struck Elias immediately. His pulse quickened. He had seen injuries like this before, and he knew the risks. Time mattered, and so did skill. Without hesitation, he swung his bag over his shoulder and followed the riders at a careful distance, making sure he remained unnoticed until he could assess the situation. The trail led him to a small clearing where a group of Apache villagers had gathered around a young woman lying on the ground. Her leg was twisted unnaturally, and dried blood stained her clothes. She was pale, her eyes half closed, and each shallow breath made Elias's heart tighten. The villagers looked tense, their faces marked by fear and uncertainty. They had heard of outsiders, some good, some dangerous. Trust was not given easily, but Elias knew that hesitation could cost her life.
Tom and Molly both paused, breathing heavily, realizing that the situation had escalated far beyond what either of them intended. They were caught between pride and practicality, stubbornness and compromise. The ranch that Tom had built with his hands and the small farm that Molly had inherited from her grandparents now stood in opposition, a clash of old tradition and new determination. In the end, the first part of this story is not about who was right or wrong. It is about a moment in time, a clash of two lives shaped by land, legacy, and ambition. It is about the calm before the storm, the quiet before emotions took over, and the way ordinary people in a small town can become part of an extraordinary story simply by standing up for what they believe in. And so, the stage was set. Tom Harris, the rancher who had faced countless challenges in his life, and Molly Sanders, the young farmer who had dreams as big as the land itself, were about to enter a confrontation that would shock the town of Pine Creek. The summer sun beat down on the fields, the sprinklers hummed in the background, and the first sparks of conflict began to flicker. unseen but inevitable. The argument between Tom Harris and Molly Sanders did not go unnoticed. By mid-afternoon, more people had gathered near the fence separating their properties. Pine Creek was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and news traveled faster than the summer wind through the fields. Neighbors peeked over fences, children stopped playing, and even the local general store owner wandered over, curious about the commotion. It was rare to see Tom Harris, a man who usually kept to himself, in such a heated discussion, and that alone drew a crowd. Molly, holding her clipboard tightly, tried once again to explain her plan. "Tom, I'm not asking for your land," she said, her voice steady but firm.
He approached slowly, keeping his hands visible, speaking softly. "I'm a doctor. I can help her. She can live if I act now." The villagers exchanged wary glances. One older woman stepped forward, speaking in their language, but her eyes met Elias's with a silent question. Could he be trusted? Elias nodded solemnly, then began preparing his kit on a nearby rock. Bandages were unrolled, herbs and tinctures placed carefully, and a small knife sterilized as best he could gleamed in the late sunlight. The villagers watched in tense silence. Elias could feel their skepticism, but also their desperate hope. The young woman groaned softly, a sound that made Elias move faster. Every second counted. He knelt beside her and examined the injury carefully. The bone in her leg was broken badly, and the surrounding tissue was swollen and bruised. Infection would come quickly if the wound was not cleaned properly. He whispered reassurances to her, not because he expected her to understand fully, but because words sometimes carried a small comfort even in pain. Elias's mind raced through everything he had learned over the years. He had performed surgeries in sterile hospitals with teams of nurses and advanced equipment. Now, in the middle of a desert clearing, he had nothing but his skills, his hands, and a handful of basic tools. The operation had to be done immediately. Elias asked the villagers to fetch clean water and soft cloths while he prepared her leg. The woman whimpered as he worked, but he held her gently, talking to her, keeping her calm. He had to set the bone carefully, realign torn tissue, and prevent further bleeding. Every movement required precision. One mistake could cause permanent damage or worse. He improvised, using herbal antiseptics and boiled water to clean the wound, tightly wrapping it with strips of cloth that would act as temporary bandages.
"I just need to extend my irrigation pipe a few feet so my crops can get water. That's all. I promise it won't interfere with anything on your property." Tom's face was flushed. The summer heat and the unexpected crowd didn't help. He had spent decades protecting every inch of his ranch. To him, land wasn't just soil and grass. It was history, hard work, and family pride. Every fence post, every patch of tilled earth, and every tree planted held a memory. The thought of someone else crossing that line, even unintentionally, felt like a violation of everything he had worked for. "I've heard your plan, Molly," Tom replied, his voice low but tense. "But you can't just put something in without asking first. This land isn't yours, and it never will be. I've spent my life building this ranch. I won't let it be compromised." Molly took a deep breath. She could feel the tension in the air, and she knew the argument was starting to draw more attention than either of them wanted. She had moved to Pine Creek for peace and to work on her farm, not to become the center of town gossip. But she also wasn't going to back down. "I understand your concern, Tom," she said calmly, "and I respect the work you've done here. But my crops won't survive this dry season without water. I'm asking for your help, not your permission to take anything." Tom's brow furrowed as he processed her words. He wanted to help in his own way, but his pride and his need to protect his land made it hard to show it. He had been in charge of the ranch for so long that asking for compromise felt like admitting weakness. Yet deep down, he knew she wasn't trying to harm him or his property. She was simply trying to survive, just like he had when he was her age. Around them, the crowd began whispering. Some neighbors sided with Tom, remembering his years of hard work and the respect he had earned in Pine Creek.
The villagers watched intently, some holding their breath, some silently praying. Night fell slowly, and Elias kept working under the dim light of a lantern. Shadows danced across the clearing and the wind whispered through the nearby trees. The operation was long, exhausting, and dangerous. Elias's hands ached, his back burned from bending over, but he did not pause. He worked steadily, carefully, as though the life of this woman rested entirely in his hands. Because it did. At one point he paused only to check her pulse and breath. She was weak but alive, a fact that gave him strength. The villagers, who had started the evening with fear, began to show small signs of trust. They brought water, helped stabilize her, and even offered blankets to keep her warm. Elias improvised anesthesia by using a combination of herbal remedies and deep, controlled breathing techniques to help dull the pain. The woman's groans became less frequent as he worked, and he focused on the task with complete concentration. Every twist, cut, and adjustment had to be precise. His mind recalled every similar surgery he had ever performed, adapting the techniques to fit the limited resources he had. At one point, he had to use a piece of wood to stabilize the leg while he worked, his hands moving quickly but carefully. Time seemed to stretch. Hours passed, but Elias barely noticed the exhaustion. He was fully present, fully determined to save her. The villagers began to quietly support him, offering food, blankets, and encouragement. Some even held the young woman's hand while Elias worked, silently showing faith in the stranger who had appeared at their darkest hour. The experience was not just about surgery. It was about trust, courage, and human connection. Elias felt the weight of the responsibility, but also the weight of hope. If he succeeded, a life would continue. If he failed, there would be grief and regret.
Their story became a reference point in the community, a reminder that even in conflicts, people could act with integrity and grace. One afternoon, Tom invited Molly to the ranch for coffee. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried significance. The past weeks had been filled with tension, compromise, and practical problem-solving, but now this meeting represented mutual respect and a step toward a more genuine connection. They sat on the porch overlooking the fields bathed in golden sunlight and spoke freely about the events that had unfolded. "I have to admit," Tom said, his voice quiet but honest, "I wasn't sure you'd ever accept a compromise. You were determined, and at first, I thought you might not understand how important this land is to me." Molly smiled, sipping her coffee. "And I wasn't sure you'd ever let me make a small adjustment. I know this ranch has been your life for decades, and I didn't want to overstep. I just wanted to make sure my crops had a chance." Tom nodded. "You taught me something, you know. Even someone who's stubborn, set in their ways, and used to doing things a certain way can learn to see another point of view. I think we both grew from this." Molly felt the same sense of reflection. "I think we did. I learned that persistence matters, yes, but understanding and patience matter even more. And I realized that compromise doesn't mean giving up. It means finding a solution that works for everyone." Their conversation continued into the late afternoon. They talked about the farm, the ranch, and even shared stories from their pasts. Tom told Molly about his father and grandfather, the lessons they had passed down, and the pride he felt in continuing the family legacy. Molly shared memories of her grandparents' small farm, the challenges she had faced moving to Pine Creek, and her hopes for the future.
Each small success, each step she took without support, reminded him why he had chosen medicine in the first place. He had been given a second chance, not only to help her but to heal himself in the process. As the day wore on, Elias rode further into the desert, the settlement slowly disappearing behind the cliffs and rocks. He felt a mixture of sadness and fulfillment. Leaving was difficult. He had grown attached to the people who had welcomed him and trusted him so fully. Yet he knew that his journey could not end here. The desert was vast and many others needed care, guidance, and healing. He carried with him the lessons of this experience, ready to face new challenges with renewed strength, wisdom, and compassion. The desert tested him in ways he had never imagined. Harsh weather, rough terrain, and scarcity of supplies had pushed him to his limits. But these challenges had also strengthened him, sharpened his skills, and taught him resilience. He reflected on how different life in Boston had been. Structured, predictable, and constrained by rules. Here, in the open desert, he was free to act on his instincts, to make decisions in real time, and to use all of his knowledge and skill without limitation. This freedom came with responsibility, and he had risen to meet it. As night approached, Elias found a small ridge overlooking a valley, and he paused to rest. The sky was a deep, star-filled expanse, and the silence of the desert was profound. He dismounted and sat on a rock, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the mistakes he had made, the shame that had driven him away from Boston, and the fear that had followed him across deserts and mountains. But he also thought about what he had gained: trust, respect, purpose, and a renewed sense of self-worth. He realized that redemption was not a destination but a process, one that required courage, dedication, and compassion.
What began as a dispute had now evolved into mutual respect and genuine friendship. The community noticed the change as well. Neighbors who had once watched the confrontation unfold now observed the cooperation and friendship between Tom and Molly. Some offered help with both properties, suggesting ways to share resources, provide labor, or exchange knowledge. Farmers who had once argued over minor disagreements found inspiration in the example of compromise they had witnessed. Even children seemed to understand that conflicts could end peacefully when approached with respect and understanding. As summer turned to fall, both Tom and Molly reflected on how much had changed. The irrigation system worked flawlessly, Molly's crops thrived, and Tom had found a renewed appreciation for communication and compromise. The land that had caused tension now became a symbol of cooperation, and the relationship between the ranch and the small farm improved steadily. The incident had also strengthened the town's sense of community. People recognized that disputes were natural, but the way they were handled mattered. Pine Creek became a place where neighbors learned to communicate more openly, to consider each other's perspectives, and to approach disagreements with empathy. The story of the irrigation pipe, once a source of tension and gossip, became a quiet example of the power of dialogue and collaboration. One crisp autumn morning, Tom and Molly walked along the boundary line that had once been the source of conflict. The air was fresh, the fields golden with ripening crops, and the cattle grazed peacefully. Tom looked at Molly and smiled.
"It's funny," he said, "how something as small as a pipe can teach you so much about patience, understanding, and community." Molly laughed softly. "I think that's true."
In that quiet moment, Elias made a promise to himself. He would continue to walk the desert, helping those who needed him most. He would face danger, exhaustion, and uncertainty without hesitation, guided by the knowledge that his actions could make a real difference. Fame, recognition, or wealth no longer mattered. What mattered was life, healing, and the quiet impact he could have on others. He understood now that every patient he helped, every person he comforted, and every community he served was a step toward true redemption. The young woman's face lingered in his thoughts as he rode through the night. Her strength, courage, and resilience reminded him that people could endure hardships and emerge stronger. She had trusted him when others might not have, and he had honored that trust with skill, patience, and care. Elias realized that the most meaningful part of his journey was not just the lives he saved, but the relationships he built, the trust he earned, and the hope he inspired. These intangible gifts, he understood, were worth more than any recognition or validation he could have received in the past. As dawn approached again, Elias rode on, the desert stretching endlessly before him. He knew that challenges lay ahead, that there would be more injuries, more communities in need, and more moments of fear and uncertainty. Yet he felt ready. He had faced the worst, and he had succeeded. He had saved a life, gained trust, and in the process, begun to heal himself. Each step of the journey reinforced a simple truth. Redemption was not about erasing the past, but about living with courage, integrity, and compassion in the present. Elias looked ahead to the horizon, the sun rising over the red rocks and valleys of the desert. He felt a deep sense of peace. The desert, once a place of exile, had become a place of learning, growth, and healing.
And I think it's funny how a disagreement can turn into an opportunity if people are willing to listen and work together. Their shared laughter echoed across the fields, a sound of relief, understanding, and hope. The irrigation pipe that had once sparked tension now symbolized growth, not just for crops, but for relationships, trust, and the entire community. By winter, both farms were thriving in their own ways. Tom's ranch continued to produce healthy cattle and lush pastures, while Molly's farm flourished under the careful irrigation she had installed. Both individuals reflected often on the lessons they had learned. Pride, patience, persistence, compromise, and understanding were no longer abstract ideas. They had lived them through a real personal experience. The town of Pine Creek continued to tell the story of the irrigation pipe for years to come, but the focus changed. Instead of being about a heated argument, it became about how two people could resolve conflict with respect, fairness, and empathy. Parents told the story to their children, neighbors mentioned it in casual conversation, and new residents were introduced to the example of Tom and Molly as a lesson in cooperation and integrity. Even years later, Tom and Molly maintained a strong friendship. They shared advice, labor, and resources when needed, and they often reflected on how the incident had shaped them both. They realized that challenges and disagreements were a natural part of life, but approaching them with honesty, respect, and patience could transform conflict into growth. For the community, the event became a turning point. It reminded everyone that even small towns could face dramatic conflicts, but that human connection, empathy, and collaboration could overcome almost any obstacle. Pine Creek became stronger, not because the argument was dramatic, but because the resolution had been meaningful, lasting, and inspiring.
He had discovered that true redemption was found not in approval from others, but in the quiet satisfaction of having done everything possible to help another human being. The young woman, the villagers, and the lessons of the desert would stay with him forever, guiding him in every step of his continuing journey. As he rode further into the vast open landscape, Elias felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was not the same man who had fled Boston in shame. He was a healer, a teacher, and a witness to human resilience. The desert had tested him, challenged him, and in the end offered him a chance at redemption he had never thought possible. He rode on quietly, knowing that wherever he went he could continue to make a difference, one life at a time. And so the wandering surgeon disappeared into the vast horizon, leaving behind a community he had touched, a young woman who had regained her strength, and a piece of himself that he had finally reclaimed. In the quiet of the desert, under the rising sun, Elias Monroe rode onward, free, purposeful, and finally at peace with the man he had become.
As the sun set over the ranch and the farm one winter evening, Tom and Molly stood side by side, looking at the fields that had once been the source of tension. The air was crisp, the sky painted with shades of orange and purple, and the quiet hum of life filled the background. Both reflected on the journey they had taken, from confrontation and anger to compromise and respect. The irrigation pipe, simple in itself, had become a symbol of resilience, patience, and the power of understanding. Tom placed a hand on the old fence post, a silent acknowledgement of his family's legacy and the new chapter he had begun to write with Molly's friendship. Molly, standing nearby, looked at her flourishing crops and felt the same sense of accomplishment and growth. Both realized that conflicts, no matter how intense, could be transformed into opportunities for connection and learning. And so, the story of the irrigation pipe, the clash between a seasoned rancher and a determined young farmer, and the small town of Pine Creek concluded, not with bitterness or resentment, but with understanding, respect, and a strengthened sense of community. Both Tom and Molly had grown, both individually and together, and the town had learned a quiet but powerful lesson that even when tempers flare and disputes arise, patience, empathy, and cooperation can turn potential conflict into lasting harmony.